At 58 years old, Margaret Doss had nowhere left to sleep but the cold shadow of a dying grain elevator on the edge of Hollis Bend, Nebraska, put out of a rented room by a landlord who wanted paying tenants, not widows behind on rent. 3 months earlier, the bank had taken the small house she'd shared with her late husband for 11 years, and the church poor fund had run dry before it reached her name on the list. All she owned fit into one carpetbag and a coat too thin for October, a Bible, a photograph, $4, and a tin cup. When the wind turned bitter that first night, she found the old Hollis Bend grain elevator standing abandoned at the edge of the rail spur, its timbers gray and leaning, its great loading chute hanging open like a broken jaw, and she told herself it was only for one night, only until she found something better. She did not know that behind that rusted chute, sealed away in a hollow no one had touched in 30 years, something waited that would silence the whole town when it finally came to light. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Margaret Doss. If you ever found shelter in a place the world had given up on, tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Margaret had not been born to hardship. She had been born Margaret in Kessler in 1830, in a farmhouse outside Hollis Bend when the town was barely more than a trading post and a chapel, the third of 6 children raised by a father who ground grain for half the county and a mother who kept a garden so orderly the other farm wives came to her for advice on everything from tomatoes to grief. It was from her father, Ezra Kessler, that Margaret learned the particular language of grain, how to read the color of wheat kernel for moisture, how to judge a harvest by the smell of the chaff, how a mill's gears spoke to a person who had learned to listen for the difference between a healthy grinding rhythm and one about to seize. Ezra had operated the very grain elevator that would, decades later, become her only shelter, back when it was new and proud and served every farmer for 20 miles in every direction, and Margaret had spent countless childhood afternoons perched on a stool in its office, watching her father weigh wagon loads and record figures in a ledger with a hand so neat it looked almost like engraving. It was in that elevator, too, that Margaret first learned the virtue that would carry her through the hardest years of her life, though she did not recognize it as a virtue at the time, only as her father's stubborn habit. Ezra Kessler believed, with a plainness that brooked no argument, that every farmer's grain deserved an honest weight and an honest price, even in years when the temptation to shave a little here and there for profit ran high among other elevator men in the region. He kept a second private ledger alongside the official one, a personal record of fair dealings, he called it, and though Margaret did not fully understand its purpose as a girl, she understood the principle beneath it. That trust, once owned, was worth more than any single transaction, and that a person who dealt honestly in lean years would be remembered kindly in fat ones. Margaret married young, at 19, to a gentle carpenter named Walter Doss who had come through Hollis Bend building barns and stayed for her, and though her father's elevator eventually passed out of the family's hands when the railroad rerouted its main line 8 miles south and the old spur elevator lost most of its business to newer, larger facilities in the next county, Margaret carried her father's principle of honest dealing into every part of her own quieter life, mending clothes for neighbors at fair prices, keeping her word even when it cost her, raising no children of her own but godmothering half the counties, and becoming, in her middle years, the sort of woman other women in Hollis Bend brought their troubles to, the way their mothers had once brought troubles to her mother's garden gate. The Hollis Bend elevator itself, meanwhile, had fallen into the long, slow decline that overtakes any structure once its purpose is stolen from it. When the railroad abandoned the spur line in the 1860s, the elevator's owner, an aging man named Otto Reinhold, who had bought it from Ezra Kessler's estate, let it stand idle rather than pay to have it dismantled, and over the following 20 years it became exactly what such places become, a landmark of failure, a place children dared each other to enter and mostly didn't, a silhouette against the sunset that older residents pointed to when they wanted to illustrate how much the town had lost. Margaret had walked past it 1,000 times in her life without ever once imagining she would come to depend on its shelter, and there was a particular quiet grief in recognizing, on the night she finally did, that the structure her own father had built his honest reputation inside was now the only roof left willing to take her in. The fall that brought Margaret Doss to that grain elevator's door had begun 3 years earlier and unfolded with a slow, grinding inevitability of a wheel with a cracked axle, each turn a little worse than the last until the whole thing simply gave out. Walter Doss died first, in the winter of 1885, of a lung ailment that had been creeping up on him for years, and though his death left Margaret without a husband, it did not at first leave her without means, for Walter had been careful with money and the small house they owned was paid free and clear. The trouble came the following spring, when Margaret's brother-in-law, a man named Cyrus Doss, who had never much cared for her and cared even less for sharing what he considered rightfully his family's property, produced a set of papers claiming Walter had signed the house over to him as collateral against a debt years earlier, a debt Margaret had never once heard mentioned in 11 years of marriage. She contested it as best she could, but Cyrus Doss had retained the county's most capable lawyer, and Margaret had only her grief and her honest bewilderment, and in a ruling that left the whole town murmuring about its unfairness without anyone quite willing to act on that murmur, the house passed to Cyrus within the year. What savings Margaret had went first to lawyers who could not help her, and then, as the months wore thin, to simple survival, a rented room here, a smaller rented room there, each move draining a little more of the small reserve Walter had left behind, until by the autumn of 1888 she had exhausted every resource and nearly every acquaintance willing to extend credit to a widow whose prospects seemed only to be narrowing. It was not that Hollis Bend was without kindness. Several families offered her meals, and old Reverend Pruitt kept a standing invitation for her at Sunday supper, but a meal is not a roof, and pride, that particular stubborn pride her father had instilled in her alongside his honesty, made Margaret reluctant to ask for more than the town seemed willing to freely offer. The landlord who finally put her out did so not out of cruelty exactly, but out of the plain arithmetic of a man who could not collect rent from an empty purse no matter how much he might privately sympathize with a widow attached to it. And so on a cold evening in October, with $4 in her tin cup and a carpetbag holding the whole of her remaining life, Margaret Doss walked to the one place in Hollis Bend she knew would not turn her away because it belonged to no one who could turn her away at all. The collapsing grain elevator at the edge of the old rail spur, the very structure her father had built his name inside of, standing empty and unclaimed exactly as it had for 20 years. She entered through the leaning door beneath the loading chute, the great wooden funnel that had once guided fresh grain down into wagon beds, now hanging open and rusted at its iron joints, and found the ground floor dim and vast, and smelling of old dust and older wood, the kind of silence that settles into abandoned places and makes visitors speak, if they speak at all, in whispers. Margaret was not afraid of the dark or the dust. She had buried a husband and lost a house, and had, in the process, exhausted whatever fear she once carried about small discomforts. She found a corner beneath the stairs to the old scale office relatively free of draft, laid down a blanket she had kept through every move, and told herself, as she had told herself at every low point of the past 3 years, that this too would be endured, and that morning would bring some clearer sense of what came next. It was on her third night sheltering there, while searching by the light of a single stub of candle for anything usable among the elevator's scattered debris, that Margaret noticed something odd about the great loading chute itself. Most of the structure had been left to rot exactly as it stood when the railroad abandoned the spur, its timbers sagging, its iron fittings rusted to orange lace, but the chute's interior, when she held her candle close, showed signs of having been deliberately altered at some point after the elevator's active use had ended, a section of its wooden lining fitted and joined with a care that did not match the general decay around it, as though someone had once climbed inside that chute not to use it for grain but to build something within it. Margaret, who had spent her childhood watching her father's handwork wood and iron with purpose, recognized craftsmanship when she saw it, even craftsmanship gone to rust, and something in her, some old habit of attention her father had trained into her without either of them realizing it would matter so much decades later, would not let the oddity rest. She spent the better part of the next 2 days, working carefully so as not to draw attention from the rare passerby, examining that altered section of the chute, and on the second afternoon her patience was rewarded when she found, wedged behind a false panel that had been fitted so cleverly it took a widow's stubborn thoroughness to locate it, a small iron box no larger than a bread loaf, its lid rusted nearly shut, and beside it, wrapped in oilcloth gone brittle with age, a bundle of papers that had somehow, miraculously, survived 2 decades of damp and dust well enough to still be read. Margaret carried both back to her corner beneath the stairs and worked the iron box open with a bent nail in the loss of her patience, and what she found inside, in the wavering light of a candle stub, made her sit back against the wall and forget, for a long moment, the cold and the hunger and every hardship of the past 3 years. The iron box held coin, not a fortune by the standards of bank, but a substantial sum for a woman who had been counting pennies for months, gold and silver totaling nearly $400, wrapped carefully in cloth to prevent the coins from clinking and drawing notice. But it was the papers that truly stopped Margaret's breath, for they were unmistakably, in her own father's hand, the same neat, engraving-like script she remembered from childhood afternoons spent watching him weigh grain in this very building. The papers were dated 1861, the year before Ezra Kessler's death, and they told a story Margaret had never once heard in all her years, not from her mother, not from her siblings, not from any of the old-timers who still occasionally spoke of the elevator's better days. According to her father's careful account, the year 1861 had brought both a bountiful harvest and a spreading war, and with the war had come speculators moving through the territory offering to buy up grain reserves at prices that would leave local families desperately short come winter. Men who understood that wartime demand would soon drive grain prices far higher than anything they were currently offering, and who preyed specifically on farmers eager for quick cash amid the uncertainty. Ezra Kessler, seeing what was happening and unwilling to simply stand by, had used his position as elevator operator to quietly organize a countermeasure. He began, with the knowledge and cooperation of a dozen trusted local farming families, holding back a portion of the county's grain reserve from the speculators, storing it not in the main elevator bins where it would be visible and vulnerable to seizure or forced sale, but in a specially constructed hidden compartment built into the loading. Chute itself, grain and the profits from its later, fairer sale meant to be shared among the very families who had trusted him enough to go along with a plan that, if discovered by the wrong parties, could have ruined him. The coin in the iron box represented the final, undistributed portion of those fair-dealing profits, money Ezra Kessler had set aside for the families who participated but had never managed to distribute before his sudden death from a fever that same winter, a death so swift that apparently left no time for him to explain the hidden compartment or its content to anyone, not even to his own wife. Margaret read her father's account 3 times through by candlelight, tears she had not allowed herself in months finally coming without her permission, understanding now why her father had always spoken of honest dealing not as an abstract virtue but as something he had once risked everything to protect, and understanding, too, with a shock that settled slow and heavy into her chest, that the very families whose fair dealing her father had died before he could fully honor were very likely still living in and around Hollis Bend today, their own hardships compounding across a generation because a debt owed to them had been sealed inside a rotting chute for 27 years. She thought of her own 3 years of grinding loss, of Cyrus Doss's stolen house and the town's helpless murmuring, and felt something clarify inside her with the sharpness of cold water. This money was never meant for her alone. It was meant for the families her father had promised to protect, and whatever hardship had brought her, of all people, to discover it after so many years, she would not be the one to let his unfinished promise go unfulfilled a second time. She did not act immediately, in part because prudence demanded it, and in part because Margaret Doss, even destitute and sleeping beneath a collapsed grain elevator stays, was not a woman inclined toward hasty decisions. She spent the following weeks doing what she had always done best, quietly asking careful questions, this time not of neighbors' troubles but of old memories, visiting the handful of families still living in the county whose names appeared in her father's account. Families like the Hallorans and the Borgstroms and the widow Odom, elderly now or represented by children and grandchildren who mostly had no idea their forebears had once quietly defied wartime speculators at real personal risk. What she learned, piece by careful piece, confirmed everything her father's papers described, and revealed something else besides, that the very man who now occupied the county's most influential position, a grain merchant and banker named Horace Pruitt, who had built his fortune buying up struggling farms at hard prices over the past 2 decades, was a grandson of one of the wartime speculators her father's hidden reserve had helped Hollis Bend's farmers resist. And that Horace Pruitt's family fortune, family legend quietly suggested, had actually begun with grain his grandfather managed to extract from a few less protected farms in that same desperate winter, families who hadn't been included in Ezra Kessler's protective circle and had sold cheap out of fear. It was inevitable, in a town as small as Hollis Bend, that word of a widow asking old questions about wartime grain dealings would eventually reach Horace Pruitt's ears, and when it did, his response was neither subtle nor kind. He had Margaret located at the elevator within days, arriving himself in a fine buggy with 2 of his hired men, and found her exactly where she had been sleeping, a discovery that seemed to please him in a way that unsettled her more than any threat could have, as though her poverty confirmed something he preferred to believe about people who asked inconvenient questions. He informed her, with the smooth condescension of a man accustomed to being believed simply because he was prosperous, that the old elevator and the ground beneath it had, in fact, quietly become his property through a tax settlement some years back that the town records had never properly updated, that she was trespassing, and that unless she wished to be removed by the county sheriff, an old friend of his, she would do well to leave both the property and her questions about ancient history behind her entirely. It was a bluff built on the assumption that a homeless widow with nothing but a carpetbag would have no means to verify a claim or contest a threat, and under most circumstances it might well have worked. But Margaret had, in her iron box, both coin and proof, and she had, in her memory, her father's own careful example of how a person built a case that could withstand a powerful man's denial. Rather than confronting Pruitt directly, she spent the following days quietly verifying his claim to the elevator property at the county recorder's office, where a sympathetic young clerk named Thomas Holt, moved by his story and troubled by discrepancies he found in Pruitt's supposed tax settlement, discovered that no legitimate transfer had ever actually been recorded, that Pruitt's claim rested on nothing more than an assumption no one had previously bothered to challenge because no one had previously had reason to. Margaret also, with a coin from the iron box, quietly retained a modest county lawyer, not to enrich herself but to help her properly document and distribute her father's unfulfilled promise, and word of what she was doing. Despite her efforts at discretion, inevitably began to spread through Hollis Bend the way such stories always do, in careful whispers that grew louder with each retelling, until the whole town understood that the widow sleeping in the old elevator had uncovered something that touched nearly every old family in the county. Pruitt, sensing the ground shifting beneath him in ways his usual leverage could not simply crush, tried first to buy Margaret's silence outright, offering her a sum that would have solved every material problem she faced. And when she declined, he tried to discredit her, suggesting to anyone who would listen that grief and hardship had made the widow thus unstable, that her claims about hidden wartime treasure were the fantasy of a desperate old woman, a strategy that gained some traction, until Thomas Holt, the young recorder's clerk, quietly confirmed to the town council that Pruitt's own claim to the elevator property had no legitimate documentation behind it at all, a revelation that shifted public suspicion decisively away from Margaret and toward the man who had built his fortune. Many now began to recall aloud, awfully quickly for a family that had supposedly arrived in Hollis Bend with so little. The reckoning, when it came, unfolded at a town meeting called that November, ostensibly to discuss county road repairs, but attended by nearly every family whose name appeared, directly or through inheritance, in Ezra Kessler's 27-year-old account. Margaret stood before them with her father's papers in hand, her voice steady despite the cold that had settled permanently into her bones over the previous weeks, and read aloud the story of a grain elevator operator who had risked his own security to protect his neighbor's harvest from wartime speculation, and of the families who had trusted him, and of the debt his sudden death had left unpaid for nearly 3 decades. She read the names of every family owed a share, and watched recognition and quiet grief move across the faces of Hallorans and Bergstroms and the widow Odom's grandchildren as old family stories suddenly gained a documented, tangible weight. And when she finished, she turned to the matter of Horace Pruitt's grandfather and the unprotected farms his wartime speculation had squeezed at their most desperate hour, laying the historical record plainly before a room that had spent 20 years assuming Pruitt prosperity and Pruitt respectability was simply fact of nature rather than the fruit of a specific, documented unkindness. The justice that followed was, as it so often is in a small county, more social than legal, but no less complete for that. The county validated Thomas Holt's finding that Pruitt held no legitimate claim to the old elevator property, restoring it instead to public ownership under a trust Margaret herself proposed, one dedicated to assisting Hollis Bend families facing hardship exactly as her father's hidden reserve once had. Pruitt, standing in the town, already unsteady, collapsed further as families who had quietly done business with him for years began, one by one, to take their trade elsewhere, and within 2 years he sold his interests and left the county entirely, a departure the town's own newspaper noted with a dryness that spoke volumes about how far his reputation had fallen. Margaret distributed the recovered coin exactly as her father's ledger had intended, family by family, and used a portion of it, along with donated labor from the very families who now understood what her father had once risked for them, to have the old grain elevator itself repaired and reopened, not as a commercial operation, but as a modest community storehouse and gathering hall. A place any Hollis Bend family fallen on hard time could find both shelter and honest help, a use that felt, to everyone who understood the full story, like the truest possible completion of Ezra Kessler's interrupted promise. It is worth remembering now how this story began, with a 58-year-old widow standing alone outside a collapsing grain elevator with $4 in a tin cup and nowhere else in the world to lay her head. Hollis Bend had looked at Margaret Doss in those early weeks of her hardship and seen only an unlucky old woman whose troubles were, however sad, simply the ordinary bad fortune of a hard world, and they had looked at the abandoned elevator at the edge of the rail spur and seen only a ruin too far gone to matter to anyone living. Both judgments mistook silence for emptiness, mistook years of neglect for an absence of worth. What waited behind that rusted chute was never merely coin, though the coin mattered enormously to families who had spent a generation not knowing what they were owed. What waited there was her own father's unfinished faith in fair dealing, sealed away by a death too sudden to explain itself, and it took his daughter's own desperate circumstance, the very thing that seemed to prove the world had abandoned her, to finally set that faith free. Margaret Doss, homeless and dismissed, became the one who carried her father's promise the last 27 years of its journey, and in doing so she gave Hollis Bend back something no amount of Pruitt prosperity could have ever provided, proof that honest dealing, however long delayed, does not simply vanish, and that the people of the world has stopped looking at are often exactly the ones still capable of setting an old wrong right. Thank you for sitting with Margaret's story and with all of ours here tonight. If it stayed with you, we'd be grateful if you would share it with someone who might need reminding that the hardest chapters of life are not always the final ones. Before you go, we would love to know, what is a time you found real value in something or someone that the world around you had already written off? Tell us in the comments below. We read everyone. Until next time, stay close.